The night Vivian Sterling lost everything began with the wrong shade of lipstick. Not because it mattered, not because anyone in that ballroom was paying attention to the color on her lips, but because she had stood in front of the mirror in the hotel suite for 11 minutes, pressing a deep burgundy across her mouth, then wiping it off, then pressing it again, telling herself that if she looked perfect enough, if she smiled wide enough, if she held Damien's arm at exactly the right angle when the photographers raised their cameras, then maybe tonight would feel like something other than the hollow performance it had become. She chose the burgundy. She adjusted the diamond brooch on her emerald gown. She walked out of that suite with her chin up and her hands steady. And she had absolutely no idea that in less than 3 hours, her husband would stand on a stage in front of 600 people and hand her heart to the floor like it was something he'd already finished using. The Sterling Palace Hotel Grand Ballroom had been transformed into something between a museum and a dream. Crystal chandeliers stretched across the ceiling in cascading layers, each one throwing 1,000 tiny lights across gold silk tablecloths and centerpieces built from white orchids and sterling silver branches. The chairs were ivory with gold trim. The carpet was midnight blue. Every place setting gleamed. Every surface whispered luxury. Every detail said, "We have always been this. We will always be this." 50 years of Sterling heritage jewelers. Half a century of sapphires and emeralds and pearls built into necklaces that sat in the display cases of boutiques on Fifth Avenue and Rodeo Drive in the Champs-Élysées. 50 years of a name that had become shorthand for old money and new ambition and something in between that the fashion world called timeless. Vivian had helped build the last 12 of those years. She knew that. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. Quietly, without needing anyone to confirm it. But as she moved through the crowd that night, accepting glasses of champagne she didn't drink, smiling at board members whose names she'd memorized before Damien had, nodding at journalists who were already composing their captions in their heads, she noticed something she had trained herself not to notice for months. Nobody looked at her the way they used to. There was a time, not so long ago, when Vivian Sterling walked into a room and people turned. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded it, but because she carried something that the powerful recognize in each other, even when they can't name it. Presence. Authority. The particular stillness of someone who knows exactly how much she's worth and has never once needed you to confirm it. That night, people looked through her. Not past her. Through her. Like she was already gone. She found her table, third from the front, slightly off-center, which was already wrong because she and Damien had always sat at the table closest to the stage at every Sterling event for the past decade. She sat down. She smoothed her gown. She placed her hands in her lap. Across the ballroom, she could see Damien. He was laughing. He was always laughing lately, in that new way he had, that bright, unguarded way that he'd stopped laughing around her years ago. He was standing with the board members and their wives, his dark tuxedo perfectly fitted, his silver cufflinks catching the light, and he was radiating something she recognized distantly as joy. She looked at who was making him laugh. And there she was. Ariana Cole, 29 years old. Fashion influencer. 3 million followers. A face that looked like it had been designed in a studio somewhere and then released into the world to cause the maximum amount of damage. She was wearing a gown that was technically modest but somehow entirely dangerous. Ivory silk that gathered at the waist before flaring. Her dark hair swept up, diamonds at her ears that Vivian noticed immediately were from the Sterling Lumiere collection. Damien had given Vivian those same earrings for their 7th anniversary. She looked away. She picked up her water glass. She put it down. She had known about the affair for 4 months. Not suspected. Known. The way women always know. Through the texture of absence. Through the way a man stops looking at you with any particular attention. Through the way a house that used to contain 2 people starts to feel like it only contains 1. She had known and she had said nothing and she had done nothing because she was still, even then, trying to figure out what she actually wanted. She had not figured it out in time. The orchestra was playing something bright and celebratory, and the noise of 600 people layered over it in that way that sounds like prosperity, like success, like a room full of people who've never had to worry about anything that actually mattered. Damien's mother appeared at the edge of Vivian's vision. Constance Sterling, 71 years old. Silver hair set in perfect waves. A woman who had decided somewhere in her 30s that elegance was a weapon and had spent the following 4 decades sharpening it. She was wearing sapphires tonight, her late husband's gift, a necklace that Vivian had helped restore 3 years ago when the original setting had cracked. Constance had accepted the restored necklace without comment. She'd never said thank you. She never said thank you for anything Vivian did. She walked past Vivian's table without looking at her. Vivian watched her go. Damien's sisters, Petra and Claudine, were somewhere in the crowd too. She could hear Claudine's laugh, that particular high, bright laugh that she deployed in social settings like punctuation, marking moments she wanted people to remember. Claudine was 3 years younger than Damien and had his same dark coloring and his same talent for making people feel like they were lucky to be near her. Petra was quieter, more careful. The kind of careful that wasn't kindness, just strategy. Neither of them had called Vivian in 6 weeks. For 10 years, Claudine had called her every Sunday morning. 6 weeks of silence. She was reading the room she'd been living in for months, finally letting herself read it all the way through to the end, when the orchestra stopped. The lights shifted. A spotlight appeared on the stage, and Damien Sterling walked into it. He looked magnificent. That was the thing she would remember later, the thing she hated remembering. He looked like the man she had married. He looked like the man who had pulled her across a rain-soaked street in Milan 12 years ago because he'd seen a jewelry display in a window that he said she needed to see, and they'd stood there dripping and laughing with their foreheads almost touching, and he'd said, very quietly, that he was going to build something like that one day. Something that lasted. She had believed him. She had helped him. She was still helping him, even now, even standing in the ruins of whatever they'd been. Because the work she'd done for Sterling Heritage over the past 12 years didn't stop being true just because the marriage was ending. The brand partnerships she'd negotiated, the heritage licensing she'd structured, the artisan relationships she'd spent 3 years building across Italy and France and Japan, the quiet, invisible architecture of a company that everyone thought Damien had built alone. He took the microphone. He smiled at the crowd. He said, "Thank you all for being here to celebrate 50 years of Sterling Heritage." Applause. Warm and immediate. He said, "This brand was built on legacy, on craft, on the belief that beauty is something you pass down, not just something you sell." More applause. He paused. He said, "I've spent years presenting a certain image to the world. The image of a man who had everything perfectly arranged." Something in the room shifted. A few people looked at each other. Vivian went very still. "Tonight," Damien said, "I want to be honest. Because this anniversary is about legacy. And a legacy built on pretense isn't worth celebrating." The pause that followed was the kind that live in memory afterward. Then he stretched out his hand. Not toward Vivian. Away from her. Toward the front row. Toward the woman in the ivory gown. Ariana Cole stood up. She smoothed her dress. She rested one hand gently, deliberately, over her belly. Vivian saw the curve of it. She had not known about that. The room erupted in confused murmuring. Heads turned. People looked from Damien to Ariana to the stage to each other. And then, inevitably, they looked at Vivian. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She sat in her chair with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face absolutely, perfectly, terrifyingly still. Because she had spent 12 years in rooms full of powerful people, and she had learned that the only way to survive a wound in public was to refuse to let it show. She had learned that from Constance, actually, which was perhaps the only useful thing Constance had ever taught her. Damien said, "My marriage has been over for a long time." Gasps. Real ones. The kind that ripple. "And I'd like everyone to meet the woman who's been bringing happiness back into my life." Ariana stepped onto the stage. She stood beside him. She was glowing. That was the word. The particular luminosity of someone who believes they've just won something. "My future wife," Damien said. "Ariana." The applause started somewhere in Damien's family's cluster. Constance stood first, her sapphires catching the light, her face arranged in that particular expression she wore when she'd gotten what she wanted. Claudine followed, then Petra, and then several of the older board members, the ones who'd never fully warmed to Vivian, the ones who'd always treated her like a +1 who'd overstayed her welcome. Vivian looked around the ballroom. 600 people. Not one of them was standing for her. Not one. She was aware of the cameras, the journalists. She was aware that her face was being photographed right now, in this moment, and that whatever expression she wore was going to be the image attached to this story when it ran tomorrow in every luxury and lifestyle publication in the country. She was aware of all of that. She kept her face still. She kept her hands in her lap. She was also aware, in some distant quiet part of herself, that she had stopped feeling the way she'd expected to feel. She had imagined this moment, or something like it, in the dark hours when she'd lain awake beside a husband who was already somewhere else in his head. She'd imagined devastation. She'd imagined collapse. What she actually felt was something colder, something that needed no name right now. It would have a name later. Constance Sterling materialized beside her table, moving smoothly through the crowd, her chin up, her silver hair impeccable. She reached Vivian's table. She set an envelope down on the white tablecloth. She bent slightly at the waist, and she said, in the voice she used when she wanted to sound private but needed to be heard, loud enough that the 6 people at the surrounding tables all turned their heads, "You've embarrassed this family long enough." She straightened, signed the divorce papers, and she walked away. Vivian looked at the envelope. It was cream-colored, heavy paper. The Sterling family lawyer's office name was printed on the upper left corner. She picked it up. She held it for a moment. Then she tucked it into her evening bag. She stood up from the table. She walked across the ballroom. She kept her pace unhurried. She smiled at 2 people she recognized, a magazine editor and a retail executive, because she was going to walk out of that room the same way she had walked into it. Unhurried, composed, certain. She pushed through the side door and into the corridor. The noise dropped away behind her. The corridor was cool and long and empty. She stood there for exactly 30 seconds. Then she started walking toward the exit, because there was something nobody in that ballroom knew. Not Damien, not Constance, not Ariana, standing on that stage with her hand on her belly and Damien's name attached to hers like a prize she'd just claimed. Not one board member, not one lawyer, not one journalist with a camera pointed at the empty chair where Vivian Sterling used to sit. None of them knew what she was carrying in her chest as she walked out. They thought she was leaving with nothing. They were wrong. She was leaving with everything. She just hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Vivian Sterling was not born into money. That's the part the society pages always left out when they wrote about her and Damien in those first bright years when Sterling heritage was rising and the 2 of them were rising with it, and the whole world wanted to know who they were and where they'd come from and what they planned to do next. The articles called her the elegant Mrs. Sterling and Damien's accomplished wife, and occasionally, when a writer was feeling generous, the quiet force behind Sterling's resurgence. None of them said where she was actually from. She was from a small city in Ohio, a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital, a father who had loved her with everything he had until the morning his heart gave out when she was 15, a childhood that was full in the ways that actually matter, in books and music and Sunday dinners and her father's particular laugh, and narrow in the ways that follow you, in tuition gaps and second-hand coats, and the specific arithmetic of choosing which dreams are affordable. She had gotten herself to Columbia on scholarship. She had studied art history and business because she'd read that it was an unusual combination, and she'd thought, even then, that unusual combinations were where the interesting things happened. She had graduated into the specific chaos of her early 20s and taken a job at a mid-level auction house because she needed work and because walking through rooms full of beautiful old things made her feel like the world was larger than her circumstances. She had met Damien Sterling at a jewelry exhibition in the city. She was 26. He was 30. He was there because his family's company was in what he called a rough patch, which was a significant understatement for a company that had been slowly hemorrhaging value for 6 years following his father's first heart attack. She was there because her auction house had been commissioned to provide valuation support for 3 pieces in the exhibition. He had noticed her from across the room. Later he would tell her it was because of the way she looked at things, the particular quality of attention she gave to whatever was in front of her, like nothing else in the room existed. She hadn't known he was watching. She'd been looking at a 1940s platinum and diamond brooch from the Sterling Heritage Original Collection, thinking about its construction, the way the craftsman had solved a problem with the setting that was actually quite elegant if you understood the period constraints. He'd appeared beside her. He'd said, "You know what you're looking at." She'd said, "Your father made this piece himself. He was 24 when he designed it." You can tell by the setting technique. He hadn't learned to master mechanics yet, so the back is more exposed than he'd probably have wanted. But the front is extraordinary. He had stared at her. He had said, "Nobody has ever said that to me about that piece." She'd looked at him properly for the first time. "You're Damien Sterling." "Yes." "Then you already know all of that." "I didn't, actually," he'd said. "I've been looking at that brooch since I was 8 years old, and I never knew any of that." That was how it started. They had a dinner that same night. Then another. Then a conversation that lasted until 2 in the morning in a restaurant that was trying to close around them while neither of them noticed. Within 3 months, she understood the architecture of his problem, which was not primarily a financial problem, though it had financial dimensions. It was a legacy problem. Sterling heritage had an extraordinary 80-year history that it was failing to translate into a modern identity. It knew what it had been. It didn't know what it was. She knew how to fix that. She had ideas that were specific and unusual and deeply grounded in the actual history of the craft, not in what the market said the craft should be. She talked about artisan relationships and heritage licensing, and the difference between a brand that sells luxury and a brand that sells meaning. She talked about how the most enduring luxury houses in the world had survived not by chasing trends but by becoming so deeply themselves that trends had to come to them eventually. Damien listened. Really listened. The way people listen when they recognize that someone is saying exactly the thing they didn't know they needed to hear. He had fallen in love with her brain first. She had loved that about him. She had loved that he was someone who could hear an idea and immediately see its architecture, who could translate vision into action, who had the particular kind of courage required to actually do things rather than just imagine them. His father, Frederick Sterling, had loved her too. That was the part nobody talked about. Frederick Sterling had been 40 years in the jewelry business, and he knew things about people that he'd never written down and never needed to. He knew them the way craftsmen know materials, by feel, by something in the hands and eyes that goes deeper than analysis. He had watched Vivian with his son for 6 months before he said anything. Then he'd taken her for coffee, just the two of them, on a Tuesday morning when Damien was traveling. He'd said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly." She'd said she would. He'd said, "Are you here for my son or for this company?" She'd looked at him across the table. He was a big man who'd been made smaller by his illness, his hands still steady, his eyes still sharp, his voice still carrying the weight of someone who'd built something real from nothing. She'd said, "Both, Mr. Sterling." And I think that's actually the honest answer. He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd smiled. And it was Damien's smile exactly. The real one, the one that reached his eyes. "Good," he'd said. "That's the right answer. Anyone who tells you it's only love when there's also work involved is either lying or naive." They got married 6 months later. Frederick walked her down the aisle himself, at her request, because her own father couldn't. She cried when she asked him. He'd cried when he said yes, though he'd composed himself by the time they walked and neither of them mentioned it after. He died 14 months later. His second heart attack. He died on a Wednesday morning in a private hospital room with Damien on one side and Vivian on the other and the window full of morning light. And before the morphine made speech impossible, he'd held Vivian's hand for a long moment and looked at her with something in his eyes that she'd understood immediately but wouldn't fully comprehend for years. Trust. Not just affection. Trust. The particular trust of a man who has put something important somewhere safe and knows it's safe. "You'll know what to do," he'd said. To her. Specifically. Not to Damien. She thought she understood what he meant. She hadn't known, then, about the documents. Those came 3 weeks later. A letter from Frederick's personal solicitor, separate from the estate proceedings, addressed only to Vivian. She had opened it alone, in the library of the house she and Damien shared, on a Sunday afternoon while Damien was at the office. The letter explained, in the precise language of legal documents, that Frederick Sterling had made a specific decision several years before his death. He had watched his son build. He had watched his son lead. He had believed in Damien's talent, genuinely, without reservation. But he had also watched closely enough to understand something about where that talent was fragile. Frederick had seen the same thing Vivian would come to see more clearly over the following years. Damien was extraordinary at execution. He was brave and driven and brilliant at the moment of action. But he was susceptible, in ways that were not always visible, to the gravity of certain people, to flattery, to the opinion of people he believed were important, to the particular drift that happens when a man's success begins to outpace his self-knowledge. Frederick had seen that fragility and he had made a decision. He had transferred the Sterling Heritage Seal to Vivian. Not the shares, the seal. What was a seal? It was, as the documents explained in careful detail, the legal foundation of everything Sterling Heritage claimed to be. It was the original trademark registration, the heritage certification, the founding artisan licenses that established the company's legal right to call its products authentic Sterling craftsmanship. It was the documentation that connected modern Sterling heritage to the original 1974 workshop where Frederick had made his first piece by hand. It was the thing that let them say, legally, in every market in the world, that what they sold was the real thing. Without it, Sterling Heritage was a jewelry company. With it, Sterling Heritage was Sterling Heritage. The distinction was, in legal and commercial terms, worth approximately everything. She had sat with that letter for a very long time. Then she had put it away. And she had not told Damien. Not because she was planning anything. She wasn't. She was 29 years old and she was in love with her husband and grieving her father-in-law and trying to help build a company. And the last thing she was thinking about was leverage. She put it away because it felt private. Between her and Frederick, a message she was meant to understand when the time came. She had not imagined, in those early years, that a time would come. And then 12 years went by. 12 years of building. The first 3 were the hardest. The years of rebuilding what had been damaged, of re-establishing relationships with the Italian ateliers and the French suppliers and the Japanese craftsmen who had quietly drifted away during Sterling's difficult period. Vivian had traveled for much of those 3 years. She'd sat in workshops in Florence and Lyon and Kyoto, watching artisans work, asking questions, listening to the history of each house and how it related to the Sterling legacy, slowly, patiently weaving the connections back together. She'd done most of it without public credit. Not because she didn't want it, because it hadn't seemed important then. What was important was the work. What mattered was that it was done. The credit was something that would come later, she'd thought. The credit would be obvious, eventually, to anyone paying attention. She had underestimated how well Damien could narrate his own story. Not maliciously, not at first. He had always acknowledged her privately. He had always known what she'd done. But in interviews, in board presentations, in the profile pieces that began appearing with more frequency as Sterling Heritage rose, the story that got told was his story. His vision, his leadership, his rebuilt empire. Vivian's name appeared sometimes. Occasionally, in phrases like with the support of his wife and the Sterling family and, once, memorably, Damien's personal taste, which he credits in part to Mrs. Sterling's eye. In part. She had laughed, reading that one. Damien had laughed too, she remembered. He'd read it, and he'd shaken his head, and he'd said journalists in that dismissive way. And she'd thought he was dismissing the inadequacy of the credit, that he was on her side about it. She'd found out later, from a mutual friend, that the journalist had actually asked specifically to speak to Vivian, and Damien had said she preferred to stay in the background. She had never said that. She had never said anything like that. But by the time she found out, it felt like the kind of thing that was too old to fight about. Too settled. Too woven into the version of their life that the world believed. And somewhere in those middle years, the years when Sterling Heritage was genuinely successful, genuinely powerful, the distance between Damien's story and her story had grown wide enough that they were no longer walking beside each other. They were walking parallel paths. And parallel paths look the same from a distance. But they never meet. His mother had always pushed it. Constance Sterling, who had never, in 12 years, called Vivian anything except dear in the particular tone that made the word mean its opposite, who had sat across from Vivian at 100 family dinners and asked about her little projects when those projects were restructuring international licensing agreements worth 8 figures, who had said to Damien, once, within earshot of Vivian, that she hoped he knew the difference between a wife and a business partner, who had, every Christmas for 12 years, given Vivian gifts that were slightly wrong. A size too small, a color she'd never worn, books on topics she'd never mentioned. As though Constance had assembled a portrait of someone else and kept giving that person gifts year after year, refusing to adjust for the actual Vivian standing in front of her. Claudine and Petra followed their mother's lead. They always had. Claudine did it with warmth, which was almost harder to bear. She was genuinely friendly and genuinely dismissive in the same breath, the way people are when they've decided someone isn't quite real to them. Petra was more direct. Once, at a family lunch when Damien was out of the room, Petra had said to Vivian, with the air of someone delivering a helpful observation, "You know, Damien's never been good at choosing things that last. His first car lasted 2 years. His first dog lasted 1. You've actually done quite well." Vivian had said, "Thank you, Petra," in a voice that closed the subject. She had thought about that comment for a long time afterward. Not with hurt, exactly. With attention. Because Petra had told her something true, inadvertently. Not about Vivian. About Damien. About how his family saw him. About the way people closest to him had decided to interpret his patterns. She had filed that information away. The way she filed everything. Quietly. Without making a show of it. And then Ariana had appeared. About 18 months ago, as best as Vivian could reconstruct, Damien had started attending different events. Fashion-adjacent things, brand collaborations, the kind of social territory that Sterling had begun entering as they expanded their marketing reach. Ariana Cole was embedded in that world. She was beautiful and visible, and she understood the language of image-making in a way that was genuinely valuable for a luxury brand trying to reach a younger market. Vivian had understood the professional relationship before she understood the other thing. And then she'd understood the other thing. The specific indicators were small. She'd read them the way she read everything, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. The way Damien reached for his phone when it buzzed and then didn't reach for it at all when she was in the room. The way he started coming home later, and the explanations were always slightly over-explained, slightly too detailed, the kind of detail that's there to fill space where a simpler truth would leave too much room for questions. The way he stopped looking at her at dinner. Not angrily, just stopped. Like she'd become background. She hadn't confronted him. People always ask, later, why she hadn't confronted him. The answer is complicated. Part of it was that she wasn't ready. Part of it was that she was trying, very honestly, to understand what she wanted the outcome to be, and she couldn't make that determination until she was certain about the situation. And part of it, she would admit to herself in the dark hours, was fear. Not of losing him. She'd already, on some deep, quiet level, let go of the version of him she'd loved. But fear of the conversation itself, of what she'd have to say and what she'd hear back and what the world would look like on the other side. But she had also, quietly, in those months of knowing and saying nothing, started reviewing certain documents. Her own documents. The ones that had arrived from Frederick's solicitor 15 years ago and had been kept, safely, in a lockbox that only she knew about, in a bank whose name was not associated with the Sterling family accounts. She had taken them out. She had read them again, very carefully, with 12 additional years of business experience and considerably more legal sophistication than she'd had at 29. She had understood what she held. She had not decided what to do with it. And then the Anniversary Gala had happened, and Damien had put his hand out toward a pregnant woman in an ivory gown. And now she was walking through the lobby of the Sterling Palace Hotel with an envelope of divorce papers in her evening bag, the sound of 600 people buzzing behind her, and something that might have been grief if it had anywhere left to go, and something that was definitely not powerlessness, settling in her chest. She pushed through the revolving door and out into the cool night. A car was waiting. She'd arranged her own car. She'd done that weeks ago. She got in. She told the driver where to go. She looked out the window as the city moved past her. She thought about Frederick, about what he'd said in that hospital room, about the way he'd held her hand. "You'll know what to do," she breathed. She hadn't known what to do for 12 years. She was beginning to know. The morning after the gala, Damien called her at 7:45. She was already awake. She'd been awake since 5. She was sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment she'd quietly leased 4 months ago, which was not the Sterling family penthouse and not the Sterling family estate outside the city, but a 3-bedroom apartment in a building in the West 70s with big windows and good light and absolutely nothing in it that belonged to anyone named Sterling. She had been drinking coffee and reading, or trying to read, a history of post-war European craftsmanship. She'd been reading the same page for 20 minutes. Her phone rang. She looked at his name on the screen. She answered it. Vivian. He sounded sober and tired in the way people sound when they've been awake all night doing the wrong kind of thinking. Damien. I should have told you before last night. I know that. She waited. It got out of hand. The announcement. I didn't plan it the way it happened. How did you plan it? A pause. I thought the lawyers would have reached you. With the papers. They had, she said. I received them last month. Then you knew. I knew you wanted a divorce, she said. I didn't know about the child. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. How far along is she? Vivian asked. 5 months. She had done the math. Actually, the moment she'd seen Ariana's hand on her belly. She did it now again without wanting to. 5 months ago. That was December. Christmas. She and Damien had spent Christmas at the family estate. They'd sat at the same table. They'd exchanged gifts. They'd kept up the particular performance of a marriage in its late stages, the performance that's not quite lying because nothing explicit is being said, just nothing true. I see, she said. Vivian, what is it that you want from this phone call? Damien. Another pause. I want to make sure you're all right. She looked at the window. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, the particular gold of early autumn in the city. She thought about the kind of man who did what Damien had done last night and then called the next morning to ask if she was all right. She thought about whether that was cruelty or something more ordinary. A man who genuinely doesn't understand the size of what he's done, because understanding it would require looking at it directly, and looking at it directly would require a kind of self-knowledge he'd never developed. I'm fine, she said. I'll have my lawyers contact yours about the division of assets. I want to be fair. Vivian. I want this to be. I'll review the papers, she said. I'll be in touch. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the table. She picked up her coffee. She was fine. That was the strange thing. She was genuinely, measurably, in some important way that surprised her, fine. She sat there for a while longer and thought about what came next. What came next, from Damien's side, was a remarkable amount of celebrating. The society pages ran the story on Thursday. Sterling Heir announces new love at Heritage Anniversary. The photographs were actually quite good. Damien looked happy. Ariana looked radiant. The headline in one publication was a new Queen of Sterling, which managed to pack an extraordinary amount of assumption into 4 words. Constance gave an interview to a lifestyle magazine. She talked about how lovely Ariana was, how naturally she fit into the Sterling family, how exciting it was that a new generation was beginning. She talked about the company's future and Damien's leadership and how proud Frederick would have been of where Sterling heritage had arrived. She did not mention Vivian once. The interviewer didn't ask. Vivian read the interview on her phone on a Friday morning, sitting in the offices of a woman named Dr. Harriet Moss, who was not her therapist or her lawyer but her personal intellectual sparring partner, which was the only accurate description for the nature of their relationship. Harriet was 73, a retired professor of business ethics who had become something between a mentor and an anchor for Vivian over the past 4 years. She had a small office filled with books and a single very good lamp, and she made terrible coffee, and Vivian came to see her when she needed to think out loud with someone who would neither coddle her nor tell her what she wanted to hear. She didn't mention you, Harriet said. She'd been reading over Vivian's shoulder. She never mentions me. How do you feel about it? Less than I expected to. Vivian set the phone down, which is interesting in itself. Is it grief? Or detachment? I think it's clarity, Vivian said. I think when you've spent a long time in something complicated, and then the complicated thing ends very simply, there can be a moment of strange lightness. Like when you put down a bag you've been carrying so long you forgot it was heavy. Harriet made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. What are you going to do? She asked. With a divorce. With everything. Vivian looked at her. I haven't decided yet. The documents, Harriet said. Yes. You know what you're holding. I've always known what I'm holding. And now you know it's about to matter. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She had told Harriet about the documents 2 years ago, not because she was planning anything, but because she needed someone to know. Someone outside the Sterling world, someone with no stake in any of it, who could hold the information and help her understand what she was holding. Frederick gave me something, she said, because he trusted me to use it well. He didn't give it to me as a weapon. He gave it to me because he understood something about the future that I'm only now fully understanding. That Damien needed someone to keep the anchor. That Damien needed someone to keep the anchor, she agreed. And that if the anchor were his, he'd eventually mistake it for a decoration. Harriet was quiet. The question, Vivian said, isn't whether I have the right to act. I have the legal right, clearly. The question is what acting well looks like. What Frederick would have wanted. What I actually want. What do you actually want? Vivian thought about it. I want the company to survive, she said. I want the craftsmen who depend on it to still have work in 5 years. I want the name to mean something. Frederick's name. The real thing he built. She paused. I don't want Damien to be destroyed. Even after what he did. Even after what he did, she said. Destruction isn't the same as justice. I know the difference. Harriet looked at her with the expression she wore when she was being careful about what she said next. Vivian, she said, the things you just described are not necessarily incompatible, but they will require you to be very precise about what you do and when. I know. And you'll need a good lawyer. I have one. I've had one for 8 months. Harriet raised her eyebrows. I wasn't planning this, Vivian said. I was protecting myself. There's a difference. There is, Harriet agreed. But in practice, the effect can look the same. Vivian nodded. She picked up a coffee. She thought about Frederick, in the workshop he'd shown her once, early in her marriage. A small space he kept even after the company grew large, where he still went sometimes to make things with his hands. He'd made her a ring there, a small simple thing with an unusual setting, and he'd said, while he worked, that the secret to a lasting peace was that everything had to be true. The structure, the material, the craft. If you built true, he said, it lasted. If you built for appearance, eventually the structure gave way. She had been wearing the ring he'd made her, she realized, when she walked out of the gala the night before. She had been wearing it the entire time. Meanwhile, across town, in the penthouse that had once been their shared home, the celebration continued. Ariana moved in 3 days after the gala. She came with 12 suitcases and a decorator and opinions about the color of the living room walls that Damien indulged with the particular helplessness of a man who has decided that happiness looks like this now. Constance came daily.
She sat in the kitchen and had tea with Ariana, and they talked about nursery colors and baby names and the kind of birth announcement that would photograph best. She talked about what role Ariana would take in representing the Sterling family at social events once the divorce was finalized. She talked about the future with the energetic confidence of someone who'd been waiting for it for a long time. When Damien was in meetings, Constance and Ariana sat together in the sunlit room that Vivian had once used as an office, and Constance told stories about the Sterling family and what they were and who they'd always been, building the particular mythology that families build for new members who are arriving to inherit it. Ariana listened. She was not unintelligent. She knew how to read rooms, which is a different skill than reading people but often more useful in the short term. She understood that Constance's approval was the currency that mattered here, and she spent it carefully. She asked about Vivian sometimes. Not often. But sometimes. Constance always gave the same answer. She was a good person in the wrong place, she'd say. Some people marry into something they don't belong in. It's not unkind to say so. It's simply true. Ariana would nod. She didn't disagree. She didn't know enough to disagree. The Sterling Heritage Board had its monthly meeting 12 days after the gala. Damien chaired it. He was in good form, confident, forward-looking, presenting a strategy for the next 18 months that involved a major new collection launch and a renewed push into the Asian luxury market. The board responded well. There were questions, but they were constructive. The mood was positive. Nobody asked about Vivian. She had been removed from the formal advisory record 6 months prior. Quietly. A restructuring, they'd called it. A shift in how outside family consultation would be documented going forward. Nobody had made a speech about it. Nobody had noticed much. She'd noticed. She hadn't said anything. Damien left the board meeting feeling he would tell Ariana that evening, like things were finally moving in the right direction. Ariana had put her hand on his arm and looked at him the way she'd learned he needed to be looked at, like he was exactly what he believed himself to be. He had slept well that night. He was sleeping very well, those weeks. He didn't know what was happening in the offices of international luxury retailers. He didn't know that questions were being asked in Japan. He didn't know that a legal department in Paris had flagged a document. He didn't know that in Milan, an atelier that had partnered with Sterling Heritage for 19 years had put a phone call in to their own lawyers. He didn't know, because nobody had told him yet, and because the questions were being directed not to Sterling Heritage's legal team, which would have kicked them upstairs immediately, but to the Heritage Certification Registry, which ran on its own slow, formal schedule and sent its correspondence by certified mail to the addresses of record. The address of record for the Sterling Heritage seal was not the company headquarters. It was a P.O. box that Frederick Sterling had established in 1997 and transferred to one specific person in the final months of his life. The mail was going there. Vivian was reading it. She didn't rush. That was perhaps the thing that would later seem most remarkable to the people who eventually learned the full story. She didn't rush. She read the legal correspondence carefully. She had long conversations with her attorney, a woman named Claire Ashford who specialized in intellectual property and inheritance law and who had, when Vivian first brought the documents to her 18 months ago, spent a long quiet moment looking at them before she said, "Do you understand what you have here?" Vivian had said, "I'm beginning to." Now, in the weeks following the gala, Claire Ashford was methodical. She filed no documents. She sent no letters. She simply confirmed, through the appropriate channels, that the registrations were current and that the transfer had been properly recorded and that the holder of the Sterling Heritage seal was, as the record showed, one Vivian Sterling, and that there were no outstanding challenges to that status. Everything was in order. Everything had always been in order. Because Frederick Sterling had not made a hasty decision in his last days. He had made a very careful one. He had consulted his own attorneys. He had structured it so that it could not easily be undone. He had considered what it might one day mean and he had decided he was all right with the implications. He had trusted Vivian that much. She sat with that trust in the evenings, in her apartment with the good light, reading things she'd put off reading for years. Art history. The histories of the great craft houses. Letters written by makers to each other across centuries, about the problem of beauty and time and what it means to make something true. She had dinner with Harriet twice a week. She called her mother every Sunday. She walked in the park in the mornings. She looked, from the outside, like a woman in the early stages of a quiet, dignified grief. She was, in fact, in the early stages of something else entirely. She was waiting. Not passively. Actively, the way a surgeon waits before making a cut. The way a craftsman waits for the material to be right. The way Frederick, she was quite sure, had waited, for years, probably, before he made his final decision. The letter from the Italian atelier arrived on a Monday. It was addressed to her. Formally. The atelier's legal representative, writing to the holder of the Sterling Heritage seal, requesting clarification on the current status of the licensing agreement that authorized Sterling Heritage to use the heritage certification in marketing materials related to the atelier's artisan partnership. There were 2 more letters by the end of the week. One from a Paris firm. One from a Swiss authentication house that had been providing certification services for Sterling Heritage's top-tier collection. They all had the same quiet urgency in their language. They were all addressed to her. She read them carefully. She called Claire. "It's starting," Claire said. "Yes," Vivian agreed. "What do you want to do?" She thought about it. About Frederick. About what he'd built. About the craftsmen in Florence and Kyoto, whose work had been woven into the Sterling name over decades. About what the name actually was, at its core, beneath all the gala lighting and the society pages and Constance's sapphires and Damien's tuxedo. "I want to make sure nobody gets hurt who shouldn't get hurt," she said. "And I want to have a very specific conversation with the board of Sterling Heritage." "When?" "Not yet," she said. "But soon." The first person to notice that something was wrong inside Sterling Heritage was not Damien. It was Marcus Webb, the company's head of legal affairs. A meticulous man, 61, who had been with the company for 14 years and who had a particular gift for noticing when the edges of things didn't align quite the way they should. Marcus had received a call from the Swiss authentication house directly. He'd also received a quiet inquiry from a major Hong Kong retailer that was preparing to place a significant order for the new collection. The retailer's legal team had done a routine heritage verification, the kind they did for any brand claiming artisan authentication. The verification had flagged something. Not an error. Exactly. More like a gap. The primary documentation authorizing the heritage claim ran through a registration that wasn't in Sterling Heritage's corporate filings. Marcus pulled the files. He pulled them again. He called the Heritage Certification Registry. And then he sat in his office for a long time with the door closed and his phone in his hand and a very particular expression on his face, the expression of a meticulous man who has just found a thing that should not be there, or rather a thing that should be there but is somewhere else instead. He went to Damien's office. He closed the door behind him. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Damien had looked up from his desk. He'd taken in Marcus's expression. "Tell me," he'd said. Marcus had told him. The silence afterward was a specific kind of silence. It was the silence of a man who has just heard something that rearranges the furniture of everything he believed. Damien had said, very quietly, "That's not possible." "I've checked it 3 times, Marcus said. "My father wouldn't have." "He did." Marcus set the documentation on the desk. The transfer was made almost 16 years ago. It was properly registered. It's been properly maintained. Damien looked at the documents. He looked at his father's signature. He looked at the name the documents were registered to. He looked at Marcus. "She knew," he said. "It wasn't a question. She's known the entire time," Marcus said. "And Mr. Sterling, the retailers are already asking questions. The authentication houses are already flagging. If we try to launch the new collection without resolving this, we're going to have a problem." "How big a problem?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The kind that can't be kept out of the press," he said. Damien put his hands on his desk and looked at nothing. "Get me the lawyers," he said. "If you've made it this far and you're feeling everything Vivian is feeling, you're not alone. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see how this ends, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you know about who really holds the power in this story." The emergency legal meeting happened on a Thursday morning. Damien's team was there. Marcus was there. 2 outside attorneys who specialized in intellectual property had been brought in overnight. The atmosphere in the conference room was the atmosphere of people who have discovered that the ground beneath the building is different from what the blueprints said. The attorneys walked through it methodically. The Sterling Heritage Seal, they explained, was not merely a trademark. It was the foundational documentation package that connected the company's legal identity to its heritage claims. Without it, Sterling Heritage could still operate as a jewelry company. But it could not legally call itself the original Sterling House. It could not use the heritage certification in its marketing materials. It could not maintain the artisan authentication agreements that allowed it to sell its products as genuinely handcrafted by the lineage of ateliers it had partnered with. In practical terms, what this meant was that every piece of marketing material, every boutique display, every international certification that said Sterling Heritage in the way that the brand meant it, with all the weight of history and craft and legacy behind the name, would need to be pulled. Or renegotiated. With the person who held the seal. "What does she want?" Damien asked. The question landed in the room with a particular weight. Because it was the right question. It was the only question, really. And the fact that he was asking it here, in this room, rather than having asked it at any point in the previous 12 years, was not lost on anyone present, though nobody said so. She hasn't said, Marcus told him. She's responded to the external inquiries through her attorney. She's confirmed that the registration is current and legitimate and that she's the holder. She hasn't made any demands. That's worse, one of the outside attorneys said quietly. Yes, Marcus agreed. Damien was quiet. What would happen, he said slowly, if she decided not to cooperate? The attorneys exchanged a look. You'd need to challenge the transfer in court, the first attorney said. You'd argue that your father lacked capacity, or was unduly influenced, or that the transfer was made under circumstances that. My father was completely competent, Damien said flatly. Yes, the attorney said. That's what would make the challenge very difficult. How long would it take? Years. And in the interim, the retailers would suspend. The authenticators would withdraw. You'd have a contested heritage claim on a brand whose entire value proposition is its heritage. He paused. The company could survive it, technically, but the value loss would be significant, the other attorney said. That's a polite word for it, Marcus said. Damien sat back in his chair. He thought about Vivian. He thought about her face in the ballroom that night. The stillness of it. The particular composure that he had always understood, when he was still paying attention to such things, as a sign of depth rather than absence. He'd stopped paying attention to such things. He'd let himself decide that her stillness meant there was nothing beneath it. It had been easier to believe that. He thought about Frederick. He thought about all the things his father had said in the last years, the months when he was ill and they'd had conversations that were more careful, more weighted, than the conversations before the illness. He thought about the things Frederick had said about Vivian, specifically. About her character. About her judgment. About the particular quality of her attention. He thought about the day of the funeral. Vivian at the graveside. His father's hand in hers at the end. He had not thought about these things in a long time. He was thinking about them now. Set up a meeting, he said. With Vivian? Marcus asked. With Vivian. She agreed to the meeting. She set the time and location herself. Not the Sterling Heritage offices. A neutral space, a private meeting room at a club that both of them knew, where the furniture was good and the service was discreet and nobody who saw you there assumed you were anything other than two professionals having a professional conversation. She arrived first. She was always early to things. She had coffee brought. She was wearing something she'd chosen deliberately. Not armor. Not performance. A dark blue dress that fit well and meant nothing. She'd left all her sterling jewelry at home. She wasn't wearing Frederick's ring. Damien arrived 7 minutes after the hour. He looked less well than he had at the gala. He had the particular dishevelment of someone who's been sleeping badly and thinking too much and isn't used to either. He sat down across from her and looked at her and she looked back at him and for a moment they were simply two people who had known each other for 15 years sitting in a room together. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he said. Of course. He had, she noticed, come alone. Not with lawyers. He'd told his team he wanted the first conversation to be direct. I've had my lawyers review the documents, he said. So have I. My father, he stopped. Started again. I didn't know. I want you to know that I didn't know. I believe you, she said. He didn't tell me either, until after he was gone. He looked at her. Why didn't you tell me? When you found out? She considered how to answer that. Because I didn't know what to do with it, she said. And because I trusted that I'd know, eventually, when it mattered. And now it matters. Now it matters. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want, Vivian? She heard the echo of the question from the meeting room. She heard the different weight it had, coming from him, here. I want to tell you something first, she said. And I want you to hear it as information, not as an accusation. He nodded. Your father gave me this because he loved you, she said. He didn't do it to undermine you. He did it because he understood something about your particular vulnerabilities that he was too careful to say to your face. He wanted there to be someone holding the anchor. He trusted me to know when to use it and how. Damien's jaw was tight. He could have told me, he said. He could have. He didn't. I think he was protecting you from having to know that he knew. The room was quiet. That's a very generous interpretation, he said. It's the one I believe is true, she said. And I knew your father. He looked at the table. What do you want? He asked again. I want to tell you what I don't want, she said. I don't want to destroy the company. I don't want to spend years in court. I don't want the craftsmen in Florence to lose their contracts. I don't want the name Frederick built to become something people associate with a legal dispute. What do you want? She looked at him steadily. I want the company to survive and to be what it should be. I want the legacy to be protected. And I want what I've given to it over the past 12 years to be acknowledged. How? She reached into the folder beside her and took out a document. She placed it on the table between them. He looked at it without picking it up. This is a proposal, she said. You don't have to agree to any of it. You have lawyers, I have lawyers. We can do this the long way if you want to. But I'd rather do it the right way. He picked up the document. He read it. She watched his face as he read. The proposal had 3 components. The first was a licensing agreement, through which Vivian would license the Sterling Heritage Seal back to the company for a defined annual fee, with legal protections that ensured it would be used responsibly and in keeping with Frederick's founding standards. The fee was not punitive. It was reasonable, but not symbolic. It was the kind of number that said, I know what this is worth. The second was a formal acknowledgement, in writing, in the public record, of her contribution to Sterling Heritage over the 12 years of the marriage. Not a celebration. Just a record. Her name, the work, the accurate attribution. The third was a charitable endowment in Frederick Sterling's name, funded in part from the licensing agreement, to support artisan training programs in the craft traditions that Sterling Heritage's work depended on. Damien read it twice. He set it down. He looked at her. That's it, he said. That's it. You could take far more than this. I know. You could, he stopped. He looked at the document again. Then at her. Why? She thought about how to say it. Because I don't want his company, she said. I never did. I wanted us to build something together. We didn't. That's a grief I'm going to carry for a long time, and it's not something a licensing agreement or a court settlement changes. She paused. But the work was real. The work I did was real. And the legacy Frederick built was real. Those things deserve to continue. They deserve to be protected. Not because of you. Not even because of me. Because they're true, and true things are worth protecting. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Damien said something she hadn't expected him to say. He said, I'm sorry. Not about the seal. Not about the documents. Just that. Simple and direct. She looked at him. She believed him. I know, she said. The agreement took 2 weeks to finalize. The lawyers negotiated the details. There were some adjustments to the licensing structure, some clarifications in the language of the public acknowledgement. Claire Ashford and Marcus Webb sat across a table from each other and worked through it page by page with the careful diligence of people who understood what they were handling. Vivian signed it on a Friday morning. Damien signed it the same afternoon. The external retailers were notified that the heritage documentation was in order. The authentication houses confirmed. The licensing questions were resolved. The Hong Kong retailer placed its order. The crisis, from the outside, had lasted less than a month. The board never fully understood how close it had come to being something much worse. Marcus understood. He said nothing. Damien understood. He said a great deal, eventually, though not to the board. The public acknowledgement ran in the company's official communications the following month. A statement, formally drafted, credited Vivian Sterling with the development and execution of Sterling Heritage's heritage licensing framework, its international artisan relationships, and its brand identity renewal program during the period of 2012 through 2024. It named the specific partnerships. It attributed the specific work. It was not front-page news. But it was true, and it was permanent, and people who paid attention to such things, the journalists, the industry analysts, the people inside the luxury world who understood what was actually being said, they read it. They understood it. A writer Vivian had known for years, a cultural critic who covered luxury and craft and the history of European making, published a piece about it. Not about the divorce, not about the drama, about the work. About what it meant for a heritage brand to actually have heritage, to have someone who understood it at that level, and what it was worth. The piece quoted liberally from the public record that now existed because the acknowledgement had been made. She read the piece on a Sunday morning. She thought about Frederick. She thought about his workshop. About the ring he'd made her. She was wearing it today, she realized. She'd been wearing it every day since she left. The Frederick Sterling Artisan Foundation launched 4 months after the agreement was signed. Vivian chaired it. Not nominally. Actually. She was in the office 3 days a week. She traveled to the ateliers. She built the program from the specific knowledge she had spent 12 years accumulating. The knowledge of who the makers were and what they needed and what was at risk of being lost and what could still be saved. The foundation worked with training programs in Florence and Lyon and Tokyo and a small city in Ohio, actually, where there was a metalworking tradition that had nearly died and that Vivian had been quietly interested in for years. They funded apprenticeships. They documented techniques. They created a certification program that several major brands, including Sterling Heritage, used to verify the provenance of their artisan partnerships. The work was real. It was the most real work she had ever done. She was also, quietly, doing something else. The apartment in the West 70s had become a proper home. She'd furnished it with things she actually loved. Books, obviously. A few pieces of art. A table that had belonged to a craftsman she'd met in Florence who was retiring and selling his belongings. A lamp Frederick had actually made, a small side piece, one of the workshop experiments he'd never sold, which she'd asked Damien, very directly, for as one non-monetary item from the marriage. He'd given it to her without question. She kept it on. She had also registered a company. Nothing dramatic. A small studio. Her own name, not Sterling. Her mother's family name, actually, the one she'd been born with, the one that had no association with luxury or inheritance or any of the things she'd spent 12 years building toward someone else's legacy. What she planned to do with the studio, she hadn't fully decided yet. She had ideas. She was letting them take their time. She knew enough about building things to know that the ones worth building don't rush. They take the time they need. They develop in the dark before they're ready for light. But the studio existed. It had a name. It had her name. And that felt like the beginning of something. Back in the world that had been so certain she'd lost everything. Constance Sterling had read the public acknowledgement statement with an expression her daughters later described as very quiet. She had not commented on it, at least not to anyone who would tell Vivian. Claudine had called. Vivian had been surprised to hear her voice. Claudine had said, "I owe you an apology." She'd said it quickly, the way people say things they know they should say but find difficult. Vivian had waited. "I didn't stand beside you in that ballroom," Claudine said. "I should have. I knew, for a while, that something was wrong. I should have called. I should have, I was loyal to the wrong thing." "Your brother," Vivian said. "My brother and my mother. Which are two different loyalties that I confused into one." A pause. "I'm sorry." Vivian thought about it. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "I mean it." They talked for a while. Not about the gala. About other things. About Claudine's life, her own marriage, her children, the things that had been building up in the months of silence. By the end of the call they hadn't resolved anything large, but they had made a small opening, and Vivian thought that small openings were worth something. Petra had not called. She hadn't expected Petra to call. Damien and Ariana had their child in the spring. A daughter. Vivian heard about it through the public announcement, which ran in the society sections. She looked at the photograph. The baby was healthy and apparently beautiful, as babies who arrive in photographs always appear. She felt, to her own slight surprise, something genuinely uncomplicated on the child's behalf. Whatever Damien was or wasn't, whatever had happened between them, the child was innocent of all of it. She hoped the child would know her grandfather's name. The real Frederick, not the burnished legend, the man who made things with his hands in a small workshop on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat with that hope for a moment. Then she turned back to her work. There is a particular kind of ending that isn't an ending. The things that happen afterward are not epilogue. They're the story itself, continuing, as all real stories do, past the moment of resolution and into the unwritten space that follows. That's where the actual life lives. Not in the confrontation or the revelation or the moment when the room goes silent and everyone finally understands what they should have understood years ago. In the afterward. In the work. In the morning. Vivian was 42 when the studio held its first showing. Not a collection, exactly. More like an introduction. 12 pieces. Each one made in collaboration with an artisan from one of the programs the foundation supported. Each one drawing on a tradition that had its own history, its own lineage, its own story. Each one authenticated through the certification program that bore the foundation's name. The pieces were extraordinary. Not because of the name attached to them. Not because of any legacy she was borrowing. Because of the work itself. Because she had spent 15 years learning, from the inside, what made something real, and she had applied that knowledge with the particular care of someone who knows exactly how long this kind of thing takes to get right. The art press came. The fashion press came. A few people from the Sterling heritage world came, because it was impossible for them not to, because this was Vivian Sterling's studio and Vivian Sterling was, as everyone had finally been forced to acknowledge in their various ways, someone whose attention to things was worth following. She stood in the small gallery that was hers, wearing something she had chosen with pleasure and no strategy, and she looked at the pieces on the walls and the cases, and she thought about Frederick's workshop and the brooch she'd looked at when she was 26 and the way he'd said, "The secret to a lasting piece is that everything has to be true." She was 42. She was just beginning. The work was true. She was building something that no betrayal could ever take away, because it was hers, and she had built it from the inside out, from the deepest part of what she actually knew, and that kind of thing doesn't collapse when the lighting changes or the room goes quiet or someone stretches out their hand in the wrong direction. That kind of thing lasts. That is what Frederick had known about her, all those years ago. That is what he had protected with the thing he'd left her. Not the seal. Not the legal power. He'd protected her time. He'd given her 12 more years in the building, knowing that what she'd build would be worth more, eventually, than anything she'd find outside before she was ready. She had been ready for a while now. She looked at the room around her. She smiled. Not the polished smile from the gala. Not the composed smile from the ballroom, the one she'd worn like a shield. A real one. The kind that had nowhere particular to be and no one particular to convince. She was here. The work was here. And it was only just starting. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment Vivian held herself together when everything was falling apart, and every moment she quietly built back something truer than what she'd lost, then this channel is your place. Subscribe right now. Leave a comment and tell me, was there a moment in this story that hit you differently? A moment that felt like something you'd lived? Drop it below. Every comment gets read. Every one. Like this video if you believe that the most powerful thing a person can do is walk out of a room with their dignity intact and come back through a different door entirely. The next story is already coming. And if you know this kind of story, if you've been the person in the ballroom who no one stood beside, and you came back anyway, and you built anyway, this channel sees you. Stay with us.